The 6th of March 2021, The Empire of the Necromancers by Clark Ashton Smith. The Empire of the Necromancers, Clark Ashton Smith. The legend of Maximus of Gloucester shall arise only in the latter cycles of Earth, when the glad legends of the prime have been forgotten. Before the time of its telling, many epochs shall have passed away, and the seas shall have fallen in their beds, and new continents shall have come to birth. Perhaps, in that day, it will serve to beguile for a little the black weariness of a dying race, grown hopeless of all but oblivion. I tell the tale as men shall tell it in Zothic, the last continent beneath the dim sun and sad heavens where the stars come out in terrible brightness before eventide. I and Maximus of Gloucester were necromancers who came from the dark isle of Nod to practice their baleful arts in Tinnereth beyond the shrunken seas. But they did not prosper in Tinnereth, for death was deemed a holy thing by the people of that grey country. The nothingness of the tomb was not lightly to be desecrated, and the raising up of the dead by necromancy was held an abomination. So, after a short interval, Maximus and Gloucester were driven forth by the anger of the inhabitants, and were compelled to flee towards Sinpor, the desert of the south, which was peopled only by the bones and mummies of a race that the pestilence had slain in former time. The land into which they went lay drear and leprous and ashen below the huge ember-colored sun. Its crumbling rocks and deathly solitudes of sand would have struck terror to the hearts of common men, and since they had been thrust out in that barren place without food or sustenance, the plight of the sorcerers might well have seemed a desperate one. But, smiling secretly with the air of conquerors who tread the approaches of a long-coveted realm, Gloucester and Maximus walked steadily on into Sinpor. Unbroken before them, through fields devoid of trees and grass and across the channels of dried-up rivers, there ran the great highway by which travelers had gone formerly between Sinpor and Tinnereth. Here they met no living thing, but soon they came to the skeletons of a horse and its rider, lying full in the road, and wearing still the sumptuous harness and raiment which they had worn in the flesh. And Maximus and Gloucester paused before the piteous bones on which no shred of corruption remained, and they smiled evilly at each other. "This steed shall be yours," said Maximus, "since you are a little the elder of us two, and are thus entitled to precedence, and the rider shall serve us both and be the first to www.writings.com/writings/short-story/61/the-empire-of The 6th of March 2021, The Empire of the Necromancers by Clark Ashton Smith. Acknowledge fealty to us in Sinpor. Then, in the ashy sand by the wayside, they drew a threefold circle, and standing together at its center, they performed the abominable rites that compelled the dead to arise from tranquil nothingness and obey henceforward in all things the dark will of the necromancer. Afterward, they sprinkled a pinch of magic powder on the nostril holes of the man and the horse, and the white bones, creaking mournfully, rose up from where they had lain and stood in readiness to serve their masters. So, as had been agreed between them, Gloucester mounted the skeleton steed and took up the jeweled reins and rode in an evil mockery of death on his pale horse, while Maximus trudged on beside him, leaning lightly on an apron staff, and a skeleton of the man, with its rich raiment flapping loosely, followed behind the two like a servitor. After a while, in the grey waste, they found the remnant of another horse and rider, which the jackals had spared and the sun had dried to the leanness of old mummies. These also they raised up from death, and Maximus bestrode the withered charger, and the two magicians rode on in state like Arab emperors with a lichenous skeleton to attend them. Other bones and charnel remnants of men and beasts to which they came on were duly resurrected in like fashion, so that they gathered to themselves an ever-welling train in their progress through Sinpor. Along the way, as they neared Yathlerium, which had been the capital, they found numerous tombs and necropoli, inviolate still after many ages, and containing swathed mummies that had scarcely withered in death. All these they raised up and called from sepulchral night to do their bidding. Some they commanded to sow until the desert fields and moist water from the sunk-in wells, others they left at diverse tasks, such as the mummies had performed in life. The century-long silence was broken by the noise and tumult of myriad activities, and the lank liches of weavers toiled at their shuttles, and the corpses of ploughmen followed their furrows behind carrion oxen. Weary with their strange journey and their oft-repeated incantations, Maximus and Gloucester saw before them at last, from a desert hill, the lofty spires and fair, unbroken domes of Yathlerium, steeped in the darkening, stagnant light of ominous sunset. It is a goodly land, said Madmewar, and you and I will share it between us and hold dominion over all its dead and be crowned as emperors on the morrow in Yathlirium. I, replied Sidosma, for there is none living to dispute us here, and those that we have summoned from the tomb shall move and breathe only at our dictation, and may not rebel against us. So, in the blood-red twilight that thickened with purple, they entered Yathlirium and rode on among the lofty, lampless mansions, and installed themselves with their grisly retinue in that stately and abandoned palace where the dynasty of Nimrod emperors had reigned for 2,000 years with dominion over Sincorp. In the dusty golden halls, they lit the empty lamps of onyx by means of their cunning sorcery, and supped on royal viands provided from past years, which they evoked in like manner. Ancient and imperial wines were poured for them in moonstone cups by the fleshless hands of their servitors, and they drank and feasted and reveled in phantasmagoric pomp. Deferring till the morrow the resurrectium of those who lay dead in Yathlirium. They rose betimes in the dark crimson dawn from the opulent palace beds in which they had slept, for much remained to be done. Everywhere in that forgotten city, they went busily to and fro, working their spells on the people that had died in the last year of the pest and had lain unburied. And having accomplished this, they passed beyond Yathlirium into the other city of high tombs and mighty mausoleums, in which lay the Nimrod emperors and the more consequential citizens and nobles of Sincor. Here they bade their skeleton slaves to break in the sealed doors with hammers, and then with their sinful, tyrannous incantations, they called forth the imperial mummies, even to the eldest of the dynasty, all of whom came walking stiffly, with lightless eyes and rich sweepings sewn with flame-bright jewels. And also, later, they brought forth to a semblance of life many generations of courtiers and dignitaries. Moving in solemn pageant with dark and haughty and hollow faces, the dead emperors and empresses of Sincor made obeisance to him, Madmewar and Sidosma, and attended him like a train of captives through all the streets of Yathlirium. Afterward, in the immense throne room of the palace, the necromancers mounted a high double throne, where the rightful rulers had sat with their consorts. Amid the assembled emperors, in gorgeous and funereal state, they were invested with sovereignty by the sere hands of the mummy of Hestian, earliest of the Nimrod line, who had ruled in half-mythic years. Then all the descendants of Hestian, crowding the room in a great throng, acclaimed with toneless, echo-like voices the dominion of Madmewar and Sidosma. Thus did the outcast necromancers find for themselves an empire and a subject people in a desolate barren land where the men of Tinnereth had driven them forth to perish. Reigned she supreme over all the dead of Sincor by virtue of their malign magic, they exercised a baleful despotism. Tribute was borne to them by fleshless porters from outlying realms, and plague-eaten corpses and tall mummies scented with mortuary balsams went to and fro upon their errands in Yathlirium, or heaped before their greedy eyes inexhaustible vaults, the cobweb-like and golden dusty gems of antique time. Dead laborers made their palace gardens to bloom with long-perished flowers, liches and skeletons toiled for them in the mines, or reared superb, fantastic towers to the dying sun. Chamberlains and princes of old time were their cupbearers, and stringed instruments were plucked for their delight by the slim hands of empresses with the golden hair that had come forth untarnished from the night of the tomb. Those that were fairest, whom the plague and the worm had not ravaged overmuch, they took for their lemons and made to serve their necrophilic lust. In all things, the people of Sincor performed the action of life at the will of Madmewar and Sidosma. They spoke, they moved, they ate and drank as in life. They heard and saw and felt with a similitude of the senses that had been theirs before death, but their brains were enthralled by a dreadful necromancy. They recalled but dimly their former existence, and the state to which they had been summoned was empty and troublous and shadow-like. Their blood ran chill and sluggish, mingled with water of Lethe, the vapors of Lethe clouded their eyes. Dumbly they obeyed the dictates of their tyrannous lords without rebellion or protest, but filled with a illimitable weariness such as the dead must know when having drunk of eternal sleep. They are called back once more to the bitterness of mortal being. They knew no passion or desire, or the like, only the black languor of their awakening from Lethe, and a great, ceaseless longing to return to that interrupted slumber. Youngest and last of the Nimrod emperors was Alero, who had died in the first month of the plague, and had lain in his high-built mausoleum for 200 years before the coming of the necromancers. Raised up with his people and his fathers to attend the tyrants, Bolero had resumed the emptiness of existence without question and had felt no surprise. He had accepted his own resurrection and that of his ancestors as one accepts the indignities and marvels of a dream. He knew that he had come back to a faded sun, to a hollow and spectral world, to an order of things in which his place was merely that of an obedient shadow. But at first he was troubled only like the others by a dim weariness and pale hunger for the lost oblivion. Drugged by the magic of his overlords, weak from the age-long melody of death, he beheld like a somnambulist the enormities to which his fathers were subjected. Yet somehow, after many days, a feeble spark awoke in the sodden twilight of his mind. Like something lost and irretrievable beyond prodigious gulfs, he recalled the pomp of his reign in Yathlerium and the golden pride and exultation that had been his in youth. And recalling it, he felt a big stirring of revolt, a ghostly resentment against the magicians who had held him forth to this calamitous mockery of life. Darkly he began to grieve for his fallen state and the mournful plight of his ancestors and his people. Day by day, as a cupbearer in the halls where he had ruled aforetime, Bolero saw the doings of the mad Muir and Sedosma. He saw their caprices of cruelty and lust, their growing drunkenness and gluttony. He watched them wallow in their necromantic luxury and become lax with indolence, gross with indulgence. They neglected the study of the art, they forgot many of their spells. But still they ruled, mighty and formidable, and lolling on couches of purple and rose, they planned to lead an army of the dead against Tinnereth. Dreaming of conquest and of vaster necromancies, they grew fat and slothful as worms that have installed themselves in a charnel rich with corruption. And pace by pace, with their laxness and tyranny, the fire of rebellion mounted in the shadowy heart of Bolero, like a flame that struggles with Lethean damps. And slowly, with the waxing of his wrath, there returned to him something of the strength and firmness that had been his in life. Seeing the turpitude of the oppressors, and knowing the wrong that had been done to the helpless dead, he heard in his brain the clamor of stifled voices demanding vengeance. Among his fathers, through the palace halls of Yathlerium, Bolero moved silently at the bidding of the masters, or stood awaiting their command. He poured in their cups of onyx the amber vintages brought by wizardry from hills beneath the ember sun. He submitted to their contumelies and insults. And night by night he watched them nod in their drunkenness till they fell asleep, flushed and gross amid their arrogated splendor. There was little speech among the living dead, and son and father, daughter and mother, lover and beloved went to and fro without sign of recognition, making no comment on their evil lot. But at last, one midnight when the tyrants lay in slumber and the flames wavered in the necromantic lamps, Bolero took counsel with Hestione, his eldest ancestor, who had been famed as a great wizard in fable and was reputed to have known the secret lore of antiquity. Hestione stood apart from the others in a corner of the shadowy hall. He was brown and withered in his crumbling mummy cloths, and his light, blue obsidian eyes appeared to gaze still upon nothingness. He seemed not to have heard the questions of Bolero, but at length, in a dry, rustling whisper, he responded, "I am old, and the night of the sepulchre was long, and I have forgotten much. Yet groping backward across the void of death, it may be that I shall retrieve something of my former wisdom, and between us we shall devise a mode of deliverance." And Hestione searched among the shreds of memory, as one who reaches into a place where the worm has been and the hidden archives of old time have rotted in their covers, till at last he remembered and said, "I recall that I was once a mighty wizard, and among other things, I knew the spells of necromancy, but employed them not deeming their use and the raising up of the dead an abhorrent act. Also, I possessed other knowledge, and perhaps, among the remnants of that ancient lore, there is something which may serve to guide us now. For I recall a indubitable prophecy made in the primal years at the founding of Yathlerium and the empire of Sincor. The prophecy was that an evil greater than death would befall the emperors and the people of Sincor in future times, and that the first and the last of the Nimbog dynasty, conferring together, would effect a mode of release and the lifting of the doom. The evil was not named in the prophecy, but it was said that the two emperors would learn the solution of their problem by the breaking of an ancient clay image that guards the nethermost vault below the imperial palace in Yathlerium. Then, having heard this prophecy from the faded lips of his forefather, Bolero mused a while and said, I remember now an afternoon in early youth when searching idly for the unused vaults of our palace as a boy might do, I came to the last vault and found therein a dusty, uncouth image of clay, whose form and countenance were strange to me. And, knowing not the prophecy, I turned away in disappointment and went back as idly as I had come to seek the moted sunlight. Then, stealing away from their heedless kinfolk and carrying jeweled lamps they had taken from the hall, Hestione and Bolero went downward by subterranean stairs beneath the palace and, threading like implacable furred shadows the maze of nighted corridors, they came at last to the lowest crypt. Here, in the black dust and clouded cobwebs of an immemorial past, they found, as had been decreed, the clay image whose weird features were those of a forgotten earthly god. And Alero shattered the image with a fragment of stone, and he and Hestione took from its hollow center a great sword of unrusted steel and a heavy key of untarnished bronze. And tablets of bright brass on which were inscribed the various things to be done, so that Sincor should be rid of the dark reign of the necromancers, and the people should win back to oblivious death. So, with the key of untarnished bronze, Alero unlocked, as the tablets had instructed him to do, a low and narrow door at the end of the nethermost vault beyond the broken image, and he and Hestione saw, as had been prophesied, the boiling steps of somber stone that led downward to an undiscovered abyss where the sunken fires of earth still burned. And leaving Alero toward the open door, Hestione took up the sword of unrusted steel in his thin hand and went back to the hall where the necromancers slept lying asprawl on their couches of rose and purple, with the wan, bloodless dead about them in patient ranks. Upheld by the ancient prophecy and the lore of the bright tablets, Hestione lifted the great sword and struck off the head of Amatmuor and the head of Sedosma, each with a single blow. Then, as had been directed, he quartered the remains with mighty strokes. And the necromancers gave up their unclean lives and lay supine, without movement, adding a deeper red to the rose and a brighter hue to the sad purple of their couches. Then, to his kin, who stood silent and listless, hardly knowing their liberation, the venerable mummy of Hestione spoke in serene murmurs, but authoritatively, as a king who issues commands to his children. The dead emperors and empresses stirred like autumn leaves in a sudden wind, and a whisper passed among them and went forth from the palace to be communicated at length by devious ways to all the dead of Sincor. All that night, and during the blood-dark day that followed, by wavering torches or the light of the failing sun, an endless army of plague-eaten liches and tattered skeletons poured in a ghastly torrent through the streets of Yathlerium and along the palace hall where Hestione stood guard above the slain necromancers. They went on like driven shadows to seek the subterranean vaults below the palace, to pass through the open door where Alero waited in the last vault, and then to wend downward by 1,000 steps to the verge of that gulf in which boiled the opening fires of earth. There, from the verge, they flung themselves to a second death and the clean annihilation of the bottomless flames. But after all had gone to their release, Hestione still remained alone in the fading sunset beside the cloven corpses of Amatmuor and Sedosma. There, as the tablets had directed him to do, he made trial of those spells of elder necromancy which he had known in his former wisdom, and cursed the dismembered bodies with that perpetual life and death which Amatmuor and Sedosma had sought to inflict upon the people of Sincor. The maledictions came from the pale lips, and the heads rolled horribly with glaring eyes, and the limbs and torsos writhed on their imperial couches amid clotted blood. Then, with no backward look, knowing that all was done as had been ordained and predicted from the first, the mummy of Hestione left the necromancers to their doom, and went wearily through the nighted labyrinth of vaults to rejoin Alero. So, in tranquil silence, with no further need of words, Alero and Hestione passed through the open door of the nether vault, and Alero locked the door behind them with its key of untarnished bronze. And thence by the coiling stairs, they wended their way to the verge of the sunken flames and were one with their kinfolk and their people in the last ultimate nothingness. But of Amatmuor and Sedosma, men say that their corded bodies crawl to and fro to this day in Yathlerium, finding no peace or respite from their doom of life and death, and seeking vainly through the black maze of nether vaults the door that was locked by Alero. www.eldritchdark.com/writings/short-story/61/